Okay. Hey, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about a couple upcoming programs we had, and there's some brochures on the back table back there. We've got one, if you're into row crops, we've got a really good school. It's called the Kentucky Agricultural Training School, and it's at the Princeton Research Station. So you've got to be dedicated because the Princeton Research Station is about 5 hours from here if you stop to go to the restroom. So, and I thought I was going to get a prize for the speaker that traveled the furthest today, and then I found out our next speaker is from Paducah, so he beat me by 40 miles. So we've got a novel endophyte tall fescue workshop coming up. That's much closer. That's going to be in Lexington. And if you're interested in grazing and the impact that tall fescue toxicosis may be having on your animals, this may be a good workshop to attend. We've got, kind of in the middle of the state, near Elizabethtown, we've got the Kentucky Alfalfa and Stored Forage Conference. So this is focusing primarily on hay. And our theme this year is going to be really focusing on producing high quality, high yielding alfalfa. So this would be good if you're an alfalfa producer. We've got a fencing school coming up. The closest location to you would be in Wolfe County, in Campton. And then I just wanted to encourage you, if you haven't picked one up, we've got the 2020 Kentucky Grazing Calendar. So the nice thing about this calendar is that we have tips for every month of the year on grazing management. So if you haven't picked one of those up, along with a real nice picture. So if you haven't picked one of those up, grab one on your way out there. All right. And then I just encourage you, we've got a great forage website. And if you've never been on there, just Google UKY forages, and that'll be the first thing that pops up. Probably the best forage website in the country, I would say. And on there, you can subscribe to something called the Forage News, and that's a little publication that comes out once a month by email, and we can mail it to you if you don't do email. All you do is put your email in there, and then every month, we're very regular on the first day of the month, this comes out. It's got tips on grazing management and livestock management and links to other articles. All right, so that's all the housekeeping that I had. Philip asked me to come talk today a little bit about pasture renovation. And I'm going to give you a little talk on assessing and repairing pugged up pastures. And pugging is just a word for that hoof damage that happens in a pasture when it's wet out and you've got livestock on a pasture. Anybody have pugged up pastures? But if you have livestock, you've got pugged up pastures, right? Especially with as much moisture as we've had. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about thinking about the damage quantitatively and then making a plan on how you're going to renovate those pastures. So many of you have feeding areas like this and that are torn up pretty good. And the closer you get to the feeding area, the worse the damage is going to be. Unfortunately, what we see every day when we go out to put hay out is that really bad damage. And sometimes we have a knee-jerk reaction to that. If we get a little bit away from those feeding areas, a lot of times the damage is not quite as bad as we think on a whole. We still got these really disturbed areas that we got to take care of close to the feeding areas, but the damage may not be quite as bad once we get away. And the technique I want to talk about today to assess that damage is looking at the pasture as a whole, just not the damage around the feeding areas. And what we're doing is quantifying that amount of disturbance that's happened. And I'm going to show you a little quadrat that's kind of divided into four to help you do that. I don't have any misconceptions everybody's going to go home and make a quadrat. But what I want you to do is just to get you thinking about quantifying that damage, not just having a knee-jerk reaction, but thinking about, is the damage really as bad as I think it is? And then trying to get you to think whether it's severe or moderate or light, and then making a plan from there on how to renovate that pasture. So that's kind of what we're doing with this quad rat. So we're quantifying the amount of disturbance, and we're also thinking about how deep that disturbance is. And you don't have to have a grazing stick. You just get a yardstick or a tape measure. It doesn't matter. And just think about how deep is that hoof action. Are they standing 8 inches deep in their areas that they've damaged, or is it maybe 1 or 2 inches deep? That matters in terms of quantifying that damage. This is from a paper out of New Zealand, and this kind of quantifies the damage in a pasture. And it looks at those two things, how deep that damage is right here on this column, and then how much damage there is in that quadrat. And by dividing that quadrat into 4, you can kind of get an idea whether it's 20% or 40% or 50%. And then using those two things, we kind of have this matrix to kind of quantify that overall damage. And for example, if you had about 25% disturbance, so 1 out of 4 of those quarters in that quadrat has some pugging damage in it, and it was 1 to 2 inches, that's some damage, but it's kind of in that very light to light range. If we get where half or more of those things are disturbed and they're sinking down to 4 inches or more, then we get into very severe damage. And I know you guys aren't going to go home and make a quadrat, but I just want you to start to think about how bad that damage really is. And then from here, we can kind of make a plan. So we assess our damage, whether it's light, moderate, or severe, and then we make a plan according to each one of those. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, is a plan for reclaiming these pastures that have light or very light damage, moderate damage, and severe to very severe damage. Sometimes when we get into this severe damage, there's nothing we can do except try to replant that sod. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about as we go through this. So if we assess this damage, this is some light to very light damage. We've got about 25% of these quadrat has pugging damage in it. The other 3 quarters of this quadrat is not too bad. And it wasn't very deep, maybe 1 to 2 inches. So that would throw us into this category of light to very light damage. So less than 25% disturbance and maybe 1 to 2 inch or shallow pugging depth. So for this particular scenario where we have light or very light damage, then we just think about things like adjusting soil fertility. So we get our soil test. We get our soil test where it needs to be. Put a little lime on it if we need it. If we need phosphorus, we put a little phosphorus on. If we need potash, we put a little bit of potash on that pasture. So adjust soil fertility according to soil test, and your agents can help you get your soil test done and then interpret those values for you. And make a fertility plan. And then just rest that pasture a little bit. So if you can take that pasture and just give it a little bit more rest this spring, so don't get on it right away in the spring, let it kind of recover. Frost seed a little bit of clover on. A lot of times when we have a little bit of pugging damage, if we can, it's kind of like a silver lining. It gives us the space to get some clover into that stand. If we can do that, frost seed some clover on right now, this time of year. We'll talk about how to do that in a minute. That's really an ideal scenario. It lets you get some clover back into your stand. And then graze lightly this spring. So don't hammer it, especially as you go into summer, but let it recover and maybe get on some other pastures as we move into summer and let that pasture recover. So when we have light or very light damage, we don't need to do a lot, maybe a little bit of overseeding, check our fertility, and then just give that pasture a little tender, loving care, and graze it lightly, especially as we move into summer. So just a little bit about frost seeding, and I know most of you are familiar with this. Simply throwing seed out onto a pasture and letting the freezing and thawing cycles, if we get any this winter, incorporate that seed into the soil. We haven't had a real hard winter so far. And I think it's important to think about that as we move forward. If our climate's changing a little bit, and we're not getting the deep freezes that we used to have, maybe we need to throw our seed out a little bit earlier than we have in the past. And I think if we target February to get that seed out by mid-February, we're probably going to be pretty good. That should give us enough freezing and thawing cycles to get that seed in contact with that soil. So in terms of success with frost seeding, we want to get that seed in contact with the soil. And that means if we've got a real heavy plant residue on that pasture, we want to graze it pretty close. And that's the only time I tell you to use your pastures is when you're getting ready to broadcast seed onto it. You want to graze it close, and that lets that seed get down to the soil, get it on in plenty of time so we've got adequate freeze-thaw cycles. And then we want to control competition after seeding. So one of the big areas that frost seedings fail in is that we do everything right, just our soil fertility, we get our seed on in plenty of time, it gets incorporated in the soil, the seed germinates, and then we don't control that competition from the sod after that seed germinates. In that seedling, that clover seedling is very vulnerable to competition for light at that point in its life. It doesn't have a big root system, and it's very sensitive to competition for light. So just leaving some animals on that pasture and feeding a little hay on that pasture can really help, because it kind of suppresses that sod, that grazing when they're picking around, and keeps that competition down from that sod. And that lets light in and lets those clover seedlings develop. And people get all worried about, well, I'm going to trample some of those seedlings or they're going to get nipped off. And they will, but if you don't control that competition, then you're going to lose all those seedlings. So you give a little bit and get those other seedlings established in that pasture. Of course, use high quality seed in the correct seeding rate. So I brought on the back table a couple publications, and there's the Red and White Clover Report, and that gives you varieties that have been tested in Kentucky. We have probably the most extensive variety testing program in the country for forage species. There's a Red and White Clover Report, and then there's a long-term summary, yield summary. And this is really the one, if you pick one of these up today, pick this one up and go home. And what it does is it gives you the performance of these clover varieties, not just clover, but all forage varieties over years. And you want to choose a variety that has performed well in at least 3 years and has an average yield above 100%. And there's some good varieties of clover out there. Probably one of the oldest and still one of the best is just a certified Kenland red clover. It just performs well over a long time and it's reasonably priced. But make sure you choose one that has at least 100% average or above over at least 3 years. So use a correct seeding rate. That means you need to calibrate your seeding equipment. Easier said than done, right? And I'll show you a drill calibration in a minute. And then get even seed distribution. We don't talk enough about this. We tell you to go out and spread clover seed in your pastures. Is it easy to get even seed distribution on a pasture when you're riding on a four-wheeler? Not really, right? It's kind of a wild guess in most cases. And sometimes we think we're doing better than we actually are. One thing that we did last year, and I'll show you a little study, is that we actually used a little GPS guidance system on the four-wheeler to get better seed distribution within the pastures. As far as broadcasting, we want to try to get it done in February. 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, 1 to 2 pounds of a ladino clover, which is a taller, upright growing white clover. And then if you're on soils that's a little drouthy or a little bit low in fertility, you might consider putting 10 to 15 pounds of annual Lespedeza in. That's a true warm season annual, so it's going to be more productive during the summer months. And it's better adapted than our red and white clover to a little bit lower fertility conditions. So if you're on a rented farm or you can't afford lime and fertilizer, putting in a little bit of annual Lespedeza on may be a good choice. There's not a lot of variety choices for annual Lespedeza. There's probably 2 that you might be able to get, and they're Legend and Marion. They're both good varieties, but some research that I did, and I was in Virginia for 17 years, showed that just a Korean variety, not stated annual Lespedeza, yielded as well as those 2 named varieties. So we did a study that looked at enhancing the precision of frost seeding using GPS. And of course, GPS has been used a long time in row crop agriculture. We really wouldn't even think about spraying or fertilizing in row crop agriculture without some kind of a guidance system. But the high price of the units has limited the use in low input forage livestock systems. But those costs have really come down. And then not only that, there's a bunch of these used GPS units that you can buy over the internet that could be applied in pastures that the row crop guys aren't using anymore, and they have moved on to new systems. So that's really kind of facilitated the use of these guidance systems in forage livestock agriculture. And of course, if you're broadcasting without guidance, it's just kind of a guess, right? So we did a little study where we took a GPS unit and we either broadcast seed on a pasture with guidance or without guidance. We did it on 4 pastures, and they were ranged in size from 6.2 to 10.6 acres. And I didn't do it, my technician did. And he thinks he's a pretty good driver, but you're going to see he's not quite as good of a driver as he thinks. And then we used a software, a GIS software, to determine misses and overlaps. So where we didn't put any seed or where we overlapped with the seed. So these are some maps. This is from the first pasture. On this side is when we had GPS guidance, or without GPS guidance. And you'll see this is not bad here. And then we got a little bit of a miss, the red here. And then I don't know what happened on this side of the pasture, but Connor getting closer and closer and closer. And these paths are all overlapped on this half of the pasture. This is with guidance here. Pretty amazing difference in terms of how even that seed distribution was when we just had that little bit of GPS guidance on that pasture. Remember, pastures, unlike row crop fields, are usually not flat and they're usually not square, so that makes driving those even more difficult without guidance. So Connor was getting tired, and this was by the time he got to the 4th pasture, right? So this is without guidance here. I think he just wanted to go home because he started to get wider and wider and wider, so he had a significant amount of misses by the time he got to the 4th pasture. And again, with guidance on the 4th pasture, he had pretty good coverage and not a lot of overlaps. So anyways, the point is that we're not as good at driving seed on as we think. When we analyzed all this data, what I want you to look at is the overlap. Connor had, on average, over those 4 pastures, a 50% overlap. So to kind of put this in terms of cost, if we figure it costs us about $25 an acre for seed and then to drive over that pasture, that's $12 an acre overlap. So if we look at a GPS unit, we could recoup that cost. It cost about $2,000 for the unit we were using, as little as 165 acres. But better than that, better than buying one, you should get your extension office to buy one that they would loan out to you. That would be a great use of extension funds, I think. The other thing I want to mention is that you can use these little GPS units can go from one tractor to another, and you can use them for multiple operations. So liming, fertilizing, even no-till drilling. We don't think about it, but when you drill into a pasture, sometimes you're pretty good at finding where your last pass was, and sometimes it's pretty hard to see. So that can really help with no-till drilling. Spraying and even spreading organic fertilizer sources like broiler litter it can be very difficult without some type of guidance unit in your pasture. So we did a demo last year in Ohio County. We had a big field day, a summer forage tour, and the young man that we did the farm, used his farm, he used our little GPS unit for everything he did. And he actually went out and bought one. He used it to spread litter, he used it to spray, and he used it for overseeding study that we did on his farm. And he became addicted to that unit because he got such better coverage using a little bit of guidance. All right, just want to mention that we can also use no-till seeding in early spring versus frost seeding. And same amount of seed, we just drill it in. And we'll talk a little bit about no-tilling in a minute. All right, getting back to this, the topic of assessing damage here. So we've got moderate damage in this picture. We've got about maybe 50, 60% disturbance in this slide. A little bit deeper damage, so that's going to put us into this moderate to severe category. So if we look at moderate damage in our pastures, again, we start with soil testing, adjusting fertility. We need to think about thickening that pasture back up because we have lost some of that stand with that damage. And we probably want to overseed with a grass legume mixture, and we probably want to do that in early spring before something else grows in that area that has been damaged. And 15, somewhere around 15 or 20 pounds of tall fescue, or 8 to 12 pounds of orchard grass. A little bit of clover in there, 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, and a pound or two of ladino clover in that mixture would be a good solid mixture that you could use to overseed these pastures with in early spring. No-till drilling is the best if we can do that because that avoids damaging the sod any further. If we do tillage, it's got to be light tillage in that pasture because you don't want to damage any of the remaining plants if you can avoid it. And if we do light tillage, we can broadcast that seed on, and then we almost have to follow it with cultipacking. And that just presses that seed into the soil and gets good soil to seed contact so that it can germinate. Just talk a little bit about having success with no-till drills. It takes a little bit more effort to use a no-till drill, and you can't use it everywhere, especially on steep pastures, but if you can, you're going to get more consistent results because you tend to put that seed in contact with the soil, so you're not counting on animals to walk it in or freezing and thawing to incorporate it into the soil. You're getting it in contact with the soil immediately with a no-till drill if it's set correctly. And you can use it successfully in the spring or the fall. So the first thing we need to do is similar to frost seeding. We need to suppress that existing sod and reduce residue. When we have a lot of residue and we try to no-till into it, we often get what's called hairpinning. And that's where that disc opener actually goes through and pushes that residue kind of into a basket down into that drill slit. And then the seed falls into that basket and it doesn't germinate as well and uniformly as we would like. We need to calibrate the drill prior to seeding. I know this has never happened to anybody in this room, but sometimes we get in a hurry and we throw the seed in the drill and we just set it by the seeding chart, and what we figure out halfway across the field is that seed's flowing a little bit faster than we thought, and we run out of seed. So taking 20 minutes and calibrating the drill is a great idea if you're able to do that. We've got a really nice procedure that we came up with. This was Jessica. Jessica was an intern for me 2 years ago, and she kind of worked on developing this method and a little video that goes along with this. And it's a really simple method that uses a chart. We can use it universally across grain drills. All we need to know is the disc opener width and how many pounds of seed that we want to plant per acre, and how much we want to plant per acre. And then it tells us how much seed this chart tells us how much seed we need to catch in 150 feet. And there's a video on this, and I'd encourage you to watch this video, not because I'm the star of the video, but it's a nice video. It's 10 minutes long, and it takes you through this method. And down below this video is that chart that I was talking about that has all the numbers on it that you need to have to use this method. Simple, very simple method. All right. Check and recheck your seeding depth. Probably one of the biggest reasons that we fail with no-till seedings is we put the seed too deep. We do not want to be deeper than 1/2 inch. And you've got to check the drill. Don't take somebody's word for it. It changes from field to field, soil type to soil type, and soil moisture to soil moisture. So make sure you check it and make sure you're not putting that seed deeper than 1/2 inch. Good general rules: if you can't see a little bit of seed on that soil surface, you're going too deep with that seed. And these are my interns from 2 summers ago, checking in some seeding depth in a summer annual field that we're seeding. There's nice gadgets to do it like this. I usually forget mine, so I use a pocket knife. But you need to dig a little bit of that seed up and see how deep it's actually going in the field. And then again, control competition after seeding. So after seeding depth, the second largest reason we fail with no-till seedings is that we fail to control that competition from that sod that comes up, gets around those seedlings and shades them out. So make sure we graze those pastures or clip them to remove that competition. Just thinking a little bit outside the box. So if we've got kind of a moderately damaged sod, so we've got some open spots in it, and we want to overseed it with something that may give us some summer grazing, maybe a mixture of crabgrass and clover may be a good thing to throw on this time of year. That crabgrass is a warm season annual grass that acts like a perennial because it reseeds itself. And it can provide a lot of good summer grazing. We usually seed it in late winter or early spring. We could smooth the pasture out if we had any damage and then broadcast on 3 to 5 pounds of crabgrass and 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, maybe a little bit of annual espadiza if you want to put it in there. Call to pack it or drag it in, or even just let the animals on it and let them walk that seed in. And this crabgrass is not going to germinate until later spring, but it's going to germinate in those open spots. And the key is you have to have an open spot for crabgrass to be productive. If you broadcast crabgrass seed over a nice, healthy stand of tall fescue, you're not going to get any crabgrass. It's got to have about a 6-inch opening for that plant to germinate, come up, and produce a viable crabgrass plant. And then you can graze it or even hay it in the summer months. And then come back in the fall if you wanted to and interseed a cool season grass into that sod. Just a little bit about crabgrass. It's well adapted to this whole region, what we call the Mid-South. So not really in the northern United States, not really in the southern United States. It's an annual that acts like a perennial, and it truly is a warm season annual. If you're using it in a pure stand, you really got to have it double cropped with a winter annual like annual ryegrass or a small grain. Good yield potential. Excellent forage quality. Average daily gains on crabgrass stands are 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds unsupplemented for stocker calves. So quality is really pretty exceptional with crabgrass. No prussic acid like we would have in a sorghum Sudan grass. This is actually some work I did in Virginia. This was 60 days after seeding. In our tobacco guys at the research station in Virginia were going crazy when they saw crabgrass like this. Growing at the research station. This is Red River Crabgrass. It's an improved variety, and there's about 6 improved varieties out there now. This was about the only one available at the time. Selected for more upright growth and more leafiness. This is just a nitrogen trial we did with crabgrass. I know I'm probably going to get thrown out of Mason County for talking about crabgrass, but what I want you to take home from this is that it's like other summer annuals. It responds to nitrogen fertilization. We had maximum yield of 305 pounds of nitrogen. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on crabgrass. You want to be down here on the straight part of the curve, at 100 pounds to 150. Apply it as a split application. But the point is if you put it out there, it's going to respond to a little bit of nitrogen fertility. All right, let's move on to this last one, which you guys will have around your hay feeding areas. There's no question about that. And that's severe disturbance. That's about 100% disturbance. There's just nothing left there. So the question is what do we do with this type of area? And again, so it's deep and plentiful disturbance in your system, and that kind of throws you into that very severe category here. So what do we do about these areas? Again, soil test and adjust fertility. A lot of times, if you're close, if you're doing hay feeding areas, you're going to have a lot of fertility there from the hay that you fed. So it may not be quite as bad as you think in terms of soil fertility. And then you're going to have to reestablish that cool season base. And the question is how do you do that? A lot of times what we'll do is we'll smooth those areas up in April, and we'll reseed those with a cool season annual. But that usually never works out as well as we think. What do we get there in those areas usually? Spiny pigweed. Love soil disturbance. And even if we replant it in April, that seedling, those cool season grasses and legumes are going to be so small in those areas that they're just not going to be able to compete with those summer annual weeds. So it can be really difficult to get a good stand in the spring, and due to that very high weed pressure. So the question is do we try to do it in the spring, or do we wait until late summer to do a fall seeding? And I tend to tell people to focus on doing something else in the summer and then coming back and doing that permanent seeding of that cool season grass and legume in the fall when the weed pressure is a lot lower, late summer or fall. So we're going to need a moderate level of tillage on these areas to kind of get them leveled back out. And then we can drill or broadcast. And what I like to do use is some type of summer annual. And I'll show you some photos in a second. But, you know, for these areas that are going to have a very high weed pressure, getting something like a sorghum Sudan grass that gets up and out of the ground really quickly and makes a canopy is important, because it's going to shade a lot of those weeds out. And then we can use those areas for grazing or hay. We did a real nice demo last year on that farm in Ohio County where we had our summer field day. You had about probably 3 or 4 acres that were just decimated from a wet winter and hay feeding. And we went in there, we smoothed it up, and then we planted a kind of a summer annual mixture on those areas. And it was absolutely amazing at how much forage came off of that area, and how it suppressed the weeds on those, on that hay feeding area. All right, so we can graze it or hay it this summer, and then we come back with a non-selective herbicide in the fall like glyphosate, and no-till in our perennial cool season grass legume mixture. And then we can kind of rotate the sequence around the farm, so wherever we disturb next year hay feeding, we can get on there and do kind of the same thing, and then reseed that in the fall. Couple tips: allow that seed to produce so that fall seeding, as it goes into the next spring, don't hammer it right away, but allow it to produce a seed head, and cut it for hay would be ideal management. If you're going to graze it lightly in the spring. We did some summer annual demos around western Kentucky, and 6 different locations, 6 different counties with producers, and most of these areas were disturbed from hay feeding. And we kind of had 4 treatments. We had a Sudan grass, we had a pearl millet, we had a forage soybean, because my friend Adam Barnes, who's an extension agent in western Kentucky, loves forage soybeans. And then we had a mixture of Sudan grass, pearl millet, and forage soybean. The soybeans struggled. They don't get out of the ground as fast as a sorghum Sudan grass. And because of that, they let weeds come up, and they kind of struggled to get established. We came back on this particular field. We had a lot of volunteer crabgrass and other summer annual grasses, goosegrass in it. And since these were glyphosate-tolerant soybeans, we sprayed some glyphosate over these, and it really released those soybeans, let them come on and produce a viable stand. On most of the farms, we did not do that, and their stands were just kind of spotty with the soybeans. Crabgrass is not always bad. It kind of fills in spots between plants. In this particular soybean stand, we had a lot of volunteer crabgrass in there, and the animals grazed that just fine within those stands, but it did hurt soybean establishment. We used on one farm a crabgrass annual Lespedeza mixture, which is actually a pretty nice mixture. They're both summer annuals, so and they mix pretty well together. and gave us a nice stand of summer annuals to graze, but they didn't do quite as good of a job at suppressing weed competition. They just weren't quite as vigorous getting out of the ground and getting a canopy as the sorghum Sudan grass was. Seeding depth matters. So this was a demo that we did in Muhlenberg County, and I wasn't there when they planted it, but my extension agent was in charge, and this was a pearl millet area that we put pearl millet in. He felt that the drill was not going deep enough after the first pass, so he lowered the depth of the drill and put the seed deeper in the ground, and then the additional passes on either side, we can see that we did not get any pearl millet. So seeding depth is really important, especially with the small seeded forage crops, never deeper than ½ an inch. And even this pearl millet, which tends to handle a little bit deeper seeding depth, was pretty sensitive. So we were getting it too deep in this particular picture. Not a success, but it was great for the field day to talk about seeding depth. And there's Daryl. The Sudan grass just got up and established really quickly and made that canopy that they outcompeted those weeds. And it was a BMR type. If you're not familiar with that, BMR stands for brown midrib. That's a mutation within that plant. It causes a midrib of the leaf to look a brown or a tannish color. That's an indication of lower lignin levels in that plant. Those lower lignin levels translate into higher digestibility and higher animal performance. So we tend to encourage people to use a brown midrib sorghum Sudan if you're going to plant a sorghum Sudan. This was a nice side-by-side. That's Sudan grass on your left, and then on the right was the mixture, which had a lot of soybeans in it and pearl millet and Sudan grass. And the pure stand of Sudan grass just got up, formed a canopy fast, and just outcompeted a lot of these summer annual weeds. There was a lot of goose grass in here in this hay feeding area, and spiny amaranth and so forth. We sampled the plots and did a first harvest on those plots to figure out what the dry matter production was. And what we found was that we had pretty good dry matter production on these plots. So the highest was with the pearl millet and the sorghum Sudan grass. They were about 5,000 pounds at that first harvest of dry matter. So that's about 2 tons of dry matter. So a lot of summer grazing or even haying there. It was lower with the beans. They just had a harder problem, a tougher time getting up and get established with the weed pressure. And our mixture was kind of in the middle there. All right. Do I have time for a few questions? So not just related to pasture renovation, but any questions you might have with your forages or pastures, I'd be happy to answer those questions. So the question is how to get pastures to green up a little bit earlier. And an early spring nitrogen application can help you get about 2 weeks earlier grazing. So if you get on some of your pastures, not the whole farm, and put about 40 or 50 pounds of nitrogen on, it's going to help bring those pastures on a little bit earlier. No miracle. And if you try not to beat them up too bad this winter, it'll help them green up a little bit earlier too. Any other questions? So the question was, if we're not getting the freezing and thawing cycles to frost seed, is it better to wait and drill? And the answer is that it may be, but I think we'll still probably, if we get the seed on early enough, we don't have to have a deep freeze to incorporate this. We just need those nights that freeze it and cause those cracks to form in the soil. I think we can still get red clover and white clover established pretty well if we get it on a little bit earlier than we traditionally have. So, but if you want to make sure it's in contact with the soil, then that no-till drill is kind of the way to go. So most of our cool season grasses, including perennial ryegrass, would be a late summer seeding would be ideal. because the weed pressure is just so much lower in late summer. In a fall seeding? Yeah. Oh, frost seeding. So are we talking perennial ryegrass or annual ryegrass? Perennial. Generally speaking, grasses do not frost seed as well as legumes. It has to do with the shape of the seed, and it doesn't get incorporated as well. If you're going to use it in a frost seeding type situation, if you could drag your pastures following the broadcasting that seed on, that will help get that grass seed in contact with the soil. And that can work in the spring, but if you're doing a complete renovation with perennial ryegrass, I would tend to prefer a fall seeding. Have any other questions? Don't be shy, it's open season on the Forage Specialist. I'll be around all day, so if you have any questions, I'll be here at lunch and this afternoon if you have any other questions. Thank you for your attention.